The late afternoon light fell across the kitchen tiles, warm and golden. But the air inside the house was sharp with tension. Celestine stood over me, her jaw tight, scissors in her hand. Without hesitation, she pressed the blades against my bank card and sliced down the middle. The sound of plastic snapping echoed louder than it should have. "Learn to live without my money," she said. Her voice clipped, almost triumphant. She tossed the pieces onto the counter as though she had severed a lifeline. For a moment, I simply watched them scatter. Small fragments of embossed numbers catching the sunlight. Any other woman of my age might have wept, humiliated at being stripped of the only access she was allowed. But I had learned long ago the power of stillness. "You're right," I said evenly, folding my hands in my lap. "I need to learn." Her eyes narrowed, perhaps expecting me to plead or protest. When I did neither, she spun on her heel and stormed out of the room, heels clicking across the wood floor until the front door slammed behind her. The silence that followed was heavy, but not crushing. I bent forward, picked up the broken halves, and pressed them together lightly, as though testing whether they still fit. The card was ruined, but it did not matter. The irony was almost sweet. Celestine believed she had cut off my only lifeline, yet the truth was simpler. The account had never been hers to control. I slid the pieces into my pocket, not out of need, but as a reminder, inwardly. A quiet smile rose to my lips. She thought she had taught me a lesson in dependence. What she had done instead was hand me clarity. I rose slowly, joints stiff but steady, and moved toward my bedroom. The cedar chest in the corner waited, a box that had held secrets longer than my daughter had drawn breath. Tonight, perhaps, it was time to open it again. When I closed my bedroom door behind me, the past pressed against me as tangibly as the cedar chest in the corner. It always began the same way the night I was widowed at 38, left with a 5-year-old girl and a mortgage that seemed to grow heavier by the day. I had dreamed once of graduate school, of teaching nursing students instead of pulling double shifts in the trauma ward. That dream ended the night I signed on for a second job at the county clinic. From then on, my life was measured in 12-hour increments, charting vitals and mopping blood from linoleum floors while Celestine slept in neighbors' spare rooms. I remember waiting outside her ballet practices, soaked to the skin by Charleston rainstorms, clutching a plastic grocery bag over my hair because umbrellas felt like luxuries. I remember sitting at the kitchen table at midnight with a spool of thread, sewing sequins onto recital costumes, pricking my fingers until the fabric bore flecks of blood no one would ever notice under the stage lights. Vacations were myths told by magazines in waiting rooms. Weekends belonged to laundry and overtime shifts. Suitors came and went, but I could never bring myself to remarry. I told myself I was protecting Celestine, that no man should ever come between us. In truth, I was simply too tired to open my heart again. Each sacrifice built the scaffold of her future private school tuition, college deposits, the down payment on her first townhouse. My knees ached, my back stiffened, but I pressed on. I told myself it was worth it, that one day she would see all I had poured into her. Yet as the years stacked, so did the silence. Gratitude never came. Instead, she wore my sacrifices like invisible garments tailored to her shape, claimed as her own. And now, at 72, I find myself with no retirement plan, only a body that has carried too many shifts and a daughter who has forgotten the price of her comforts. I brushed my hand across the cedar chest, the wood cool under my palm, and knew the time for silence had ended. Celestine built her world on appearances, and she wore them like armor. The polished Lexus in the driveway, the rows of designer shoes neatly lined in her closet, The real estate office with glass walls and a receptionist who greeted her with reverence. All of it spoke to a life she insisted was hers alone. At cocktail parties, her friends admired her flair, her ambition, her independence. They glanced at me politely, lowering their voices as she introduced me with a dismissive smile. "This is my mother. She lives with me now. I try to help her as best I can." The words stung, delivered with the same casual tone one might use for a pet in need of care. Their eyes softened with pity, and I forced a tight smile, letting the lie hang in the air uncorrected. They did not know that every mortgage Celestine had signed bore the shadow of my savings, that her seed capital had been drawn not from her talent, but from bonds I purchased years ago. She called herself self-made, while my lifetime of overtime wages formed the bricks of her empire. I endured the small humiliations she scattered like crumbs, her friends asking if I needed help with my coat, her subtle jokes about how expensive it was to keep an aging parent. I held my tongue, not because I lacked the words, but because I measured them carefully, saving them for the moment when truth would strike hardest. Inside, a storm gathered. My silence was no longer the silence of submission, but of calculation. I let her parade in her finery, let her boast about being the architect of her own success. Every claim she made was another line drawn in the ledger of deceit I kept quietly in my heart. One day soon, I knew, the balance would shift, and she would learn that illusions cannot pay their own debts. And when that moment arrived, I would be ready to collect. The pieces of my bank card still lay hidden in the pocket of my robe when the next wound arrived. It was late, the kind of night when Charleston streets fall silent and the ocean breeze drifts faintly through open windows. I had risen to fetch a glass of water when I heard Celestine's voice carrying down the hall, sharp and animated. I paused outside her office door, the glow of her desk lamp spilling beneath it. "She won't even notice when I sign the papers." She laughed into the phone. "The old place is practically worthless to her. Perfect collateral. By the time she realizes, the deal will be done, and the firm will double its footprint." The words struck harder than the scissors ever had. My old house, the one I had clung to after my husband's death. The house where Celestine took her first steps. The home that carried the weight of every sacrifice was now reduced to nothing more than a pawn in her ambition. I pressed a hand to the wall, steadying myself against the tremor that rippled through me. For a moment, grief nearly swallowed me whole. How many nights had I mopped hospital floors so that house would remain ours? How many times had I patched its roof myself rather than hire a man I couldn't afford? Her laughter floated out again. Careless and cold, I turned away, my water forgotten. Something inside me shifted. It was not rage exactly, nor sorrow, but a kind of fierce clarity. Celestine had mistaken my quiet for blindness, my endurance for weakness. She believed she could strip me of dignity and history without consequence. But she had miscalculated. I returned to my room, sat at my desk, and pulled a sheet of paper from the drawer. My pen hovered for only a moment before moving steadily across the page. I began sketching not a letter of confrontation, but the outline of a plan she would never see coming. The paper I had sketched my thoughts upon was only the beginning. To act, I needed proof hard, undeniable proof of what was mine. In the dim light of my bedroom, I slid open the closet door and knelt before the cedar chest tucked in the corner. Its hinges groaned, as if reluctant to reveal what had been hidden for decades. Inside, the scent of aged wood and lavender sachets rose to meet me. Beneath old quilts and photographs rested the documents that had outlived my youth, the original deed to my husband's first house, the stock certificates he had left me, and a small leather ledger with entries in my careful script. These were the records of every sacrifice I had made. Every dollar stretched until it snapped. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted a sealed folder. Inside lay the trust agreement my husband and I had established before his illness consumed him. I traced the embossed seal with a kind of reverence. The truth gleamed clear as daylight. Celestine had never been the owner of our assets. She was merely an authorized user, permitted access so long as I allowed it. I sat back on my heels, the weight of vindication pressing down as heavily as the grief that came with it. All these years she had strutted in borrowed feathers, never realizing the nest had always been mine. Reaching for the phone, I dialed a number engraved in my memory as firmly as my daughter's birthday. Mr. Langford's voice, steady and low, answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said warmly. "It's been some time." I explained briefly, my tone calm, deliberate. He listened without interruption, then cleared his throat. "You may recall a clause we set years ago, a contingency for exactly this kind of situation. One command, and all secondary access can be revoked. The assets consolidate into your sole account. Clean, immediate, final." The word final lingered like a promise. I thanked him and closed the cedar chest. As the lid clicked shut, I felt the first true spark of power return to my hands, carrying me toward what had to come next. The morning broke pale and quiet, the kind of dawn that makes even a weary soul believe the world might start fresh. I sat at my desk with the documents spread before me, the trust papers and Mr. Langford's careful instructions. My hands did not shake as I powered on the laptop and entered the secure portal. Each prompt appeared with clinical precision: confirm identity, enter access code, select action. With a steady breath, I typed the words that had slept in legal ink for decades. Protocol 0. A final window opened. Waiting for confirmation. I rested my finger above the key, remembering the years of silence, of being dismissed in public, of sewing costumes at midnight while Celestine basked under stage lights. Then I pressed down. The system processed in a heartbeat. All secondary access revoked. Assets consolidated. A rush of relief filled my chest, as though a weight I had carried since widowhood finally slid from my shoulders. My daughter no longer held even the illusion of control. The nest was mine again, feathers intact. I leaned back and let the stillness settle. "You thought you clipped my wings," I whispered to the empty room. I was only folding them. Somewhere across town, Celestine was no doubt pacing her office, sipping coffee from a porcelain cup, boasting about the expansion she had already promised. Her voice, bright and commanding, would be spinning futures from air, her colleagues nodding along in admiration. She did not know that the very foundation she stood upon had just shifted. I closed the laptop and slid the documents back into the cedar chest, locking it with deliberate care. The broken bank card pieces still rested inside my pocket, sharp edges pressing against the fabric. They no longer felt like symbols of defeat, but like relics of a battle I had already begun to win. The sun climbed higher, pouring through the blinds, and I rose to face the day. My silence had ended. The storm would now be hers to weather. By noon the following day, I was already back from the market, a basket of fresh peaches on my counter, when I imagined where Celestine must be. She had spoken endlessly about the brunch in Savannah, a gathering of potential investors, hosted at one of the city's priciest cafes. To her, it was not just a meal, but a stage. Every plate of oysters and glass of champagne, another prop in the theater of her success. I could almost see her, seated at the center of the table, laughing with too much confidence, her hands adorned with rings I had quietly paid for years ago. The clients, eager to be charmed, would lean in closer, hanging on her every word as she painted pictures of expansion and profit. Then the bill would arrive. With a flick of her manicured nails, she would draw out her platinum card and slide it across the leather folder. A pause, a beep, and then declined. I pictured her smile faltering as she waved it off. She would reach again, this time for the silver card in her wallet. Another beep. Declined. The laughter around her would grow uneasy, voices lowering to whispers. Forks and glasses would still, the polished rhythm of the cafe disrupted by her visible unraveling. The mask of invincibility she had cultivated so carefully would begin to crack. Her phone would appear in her hand next, her voice sharp with forced calm as she dialed the bank. The cafe's hum would hush around her as she pressed the call to her ear, and then the words, spoken with practiced courtesy. "I'm sorry, ma'am, only Mrs. Amara Caldwell is the sole account holder. Your access has been revoked." In that instant, I knew. The scaffolding of her illusion would collapse. The brunch she imagined as her coronation would instead become her public undoing. Back in Charleston, I let the peaches roll gently from my hands into a bowl. The sweetness of their scent filled the room as I breathed deeply, steady and calm, already bracing for the storm that would follow her home. By the week's end, the story had traveled faster than any rumor I could have started myself. In Savannah's circles, whispers carried across luncheons and business meetings. Celestine's cards had been denied, her firm's accounts frozen, her brilliance suddenly questioned. Investors who once showered her with attention now found urgent reasons to delay meetings. Colleagues excused themselves from phone calls. The air around her thinned until she stood alone in the middle of her own stage, at home. The mask dropped. She stormed into my room, eyes wild, voice raw with fury. "How could you do this to me?" she shouted, as though I had committed a crime against her birthright. I met her rage with stillness. "I didn't take anything from you," I said evenly. "I just stopped giving." Her face twisted, searching for a retort. But the truth left her empty-handed. She slammed the door behind her, retreating into a silence that was louder than any scream. The reckoning became undeniable at our family reunion 2 Sundays later. My siblings, my nieces and nephews, all gathered under the oak trees in my cousin's yard. It didn't take long before the questions began gentle at first, then sharper, directed at Celestine. She tried to laugh them off, but the cracks showed. I stood quietly as the truth surfaced in fragments the houses bought with my bonds, the firm financed by my trust, the life constructed not from her own hands, but from mine. My family's eyes shifted toward me, some filled with pity, others with admiration. Celestine shrank under their gaze, her voice faltering, her charm abandoned. For the first time, she stood revealed not as the golden daughter, but as a woman draped in borrowed feathers. And as she lowered her head, the isolation around her grew as visible as the shame on her face. I let the old house go without ceremony. The rooms echoed with memories, but they were heavy ones. Arguments pressed into the wallpaper, sacrifices carved into the floors. Signing the deed away felt less like a loss and more like shedding a skin I no longer needed. I found a modest cottage on Tybee Island, painted the pale blue of sea glass. The air was salted, the mornings filled with gulls calling across the tide. For the first time in decades, I owned my days. I planted roses along the fence, their roots steadying in sandy soil. I joined a knitting circle at the library, a group of women whose laughter stitched itself into my evenings, books piled beside my bed again, no longer neglected. I learned the rhythm of quiet joy, coffee steaming on the porch, waves curling toward shore, the sound of my own breath unhurried. It was in that quiet that Celestine arrived. She came unannounced one gray afternoon, her figure framed in my doorway. The fire had drained from her. What remained was a daughter stripped of her audience, her voice small for the first time in years. "Mother," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "Please forgive me. I didn't know what I was doing. I thought I was strong. But without you, I have nothing." I studied her. The same child I once carried on my hip. The same woman who had tried to erase me. My heart ached, but clarity anchored me. Love without respect is debt, I told her, my voice calm, unwavering, and I've stopped paying. Her tears fell freely, but I did not move to catch them. She turned away at last, shoulders bent, leaving the cottage door swinging softly in her wake. I closed it gently and turned back toward the roses blooming in the garden, their petals opening to the sea air, already facing the light of tomorrow. At 73, my life feels quieter, yet fuller than it ever did in the bustling years of sacrifice. The cottage has become my sanctuary, its walls holding only my laughter, my sighs, my prayers. I wake each morning not to someone else's demands, but to the slow unfurling of dawn across the sea. Freedom, I have learned, does not come from the weight of wealth, but from the lightness of dignity. On my writing desk sits a small wooden box. Inside it lie the jagged halves of the bank card. Celestine once cut in triumph. For a long while, I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. They are not relics of humiliation, but trophies of rebirth. Each fragment reminds me of the night she tried to sever my worth, and of the dawn when I discovered that she had only sharpened my resolve. Sometimes I open the box, hold those plastic pieces in my palm, and feel the strange gratitude that comes with survival. They thought they were teaching me dependence. Instead, I learned independence twice over, once as a widow carrying a child on her hip, and again as a mother reclaiming the voice she had allowed to be buried. To those who listen now, I say this with clarity. You cannot measure a life by what others claim for you. You measure it by what you refuse to surrender your self-respect. Your right to be seen, your quiet strength when the world insists on your silence. I no longer fear closed doors. I have built my own thresholds, chosen who may step across, and barred those who mistake love for ownership. The final lesson is simple. Carved deep into my bones, respect first, entry second.